The first derivative transactions appear in the middle of the Bronze Age and tend to involve farmers, miners, and other primary producers who are setting prices for their output before investing the time and capital necessary to produce that output. As early as the 19th century BC, we have cuneiform tablets detailing contracts for commodity deliveries on future dates, things like wood, sesame seeds, and even slaves. Now, this type of contract where we simply state a particular quantity or quality of goods will be delivered at some fixed date in the future is what we today refer to as a forward contract. In a forward contract, no money actually changes hands between participants until the physical delivery of goods takes place. And as such, both parties are technically at risk of default by the other. One, because the buyer might not show up, or alternatively, the seller might not show up. Now, of course, as with all contracts, the two parties to this particular agreement are free to establish whatever terms they want. Generally, if you are trying to set prices for exotic goods or distant delivery dates, or you want unusual contract features to be built in, this will tend to increase the frictional costs, like searching for counterparties, and might substantially reduce the liquidity of a particular contract, which can lead to fairly inefficient pricing at the end of the day. Now, regarding the pricing of forward contracts, it's worth considering how this is accomplished. In general, when we're looking at a delivery contract for a relatively soon period or something that's going to occur in the relatively near future, then our estimates of what the price should be is relatively straightforward. You consider what the price of a particular good is today, the cost of storing that good until the delivery date, and the cost of financing that purchase until the delivery date. The major problem for longer dated forward contracts is, of course, the notion of what future supply and demand equilibrium might look like. The current price today reflects our current supply and demand equilibrium, and we typically assume that things in the future will resemble the near past, which is why forward pricing starts off with the assessment of what today's price is for a particular commodity. However, this type of no arbitrage pricing precludes the notion that we might have excess production at a particular point in time or excess demand. And so what we want to be careful about is that market pricing does not always reflect that relationship. Rather, market pricing reflects that relationship layered on top of people's perception about what the supply and demand equilibrium might look like at the delivery date. For instance, if there's an excess amount of production that's expected in the future, then prices for delivery at those times could be even lower than today's price, what we would call a negative cost of carry. This happened in particular in May of 2020, when the COVID-19 crisis collapsed demand for refined oil products around the world, but there was still a lot of oil in the pipeline, no pun intended, coming from the ground into the refineries and finally out to market. The real concern was that enough crude oil was being refined into gasoline that there was simply no place to store it all. Most of the time, the industry runs on a notion of product being refined and being consumed at the same time as a simple flow model. But when all of a sudden there's very rapid decline in demand, well, there's a pretty significant backup of supply that's still due to come online. And as a result, we actually saw prices for West Texas Intermediate collapse into negative range. Prices of Western Canada Select fell as far as $30 to $40 a barrel below zero. Similarly, though, if people are expecting supplies to be thin in the future, one of the things we notice is that prices will often rise ahead of time as people begin to hoard for the possibility that there's simply going to be less available supply in the future. Now, the first time we see somebody engaging in this kind of forecasting activity quite clearly is Thalis of Miletus. Thales is one of the oldest Greek philosophers of the classical era, and he's a well-known astronomer as well. And after realizing that philosophers were not a well-paying job, the legend goes that he wanted to demonstrate to others that it was something that he could apply that his wisdom to. That at the end of the day, being smart was superior to being rich because you could use your smarts to get rich. And he demonstrated this effectively by using astronomy to forecast that there was going to be a bumper crop in olives one particular year. And as a result of his forecast, he secured a contract from all of the olive presses in his home city of Miletus and the nearby city of Chios, such that he would have exclusive rights to use the olive presses during harvest. Now, of course, this meant that if there was a poor harvest, he would have already paid for the exclusive use of the presses and would have a hard time recovering his investment. On the other hand, if there was a bumper crop in olives, as he had predicted, then this would have meant a very high demand and thus very high prices, higher than he had paid ahead of time to secure access to the olive presses. Now, at the time, 26 centuries ago, there were no such laws in place to prevent people from cornering a market this way. It was simply seen as being a very risky speculation on his part. Had the harvest been poor, Thales most certainly would have been ruined. On the other hand, the reason we know about this is that Aristotle records in the Politics that Thales made himself a tidy sum off of this because his forecast turned out to be right. Now, even in the modern day, speculators are still making a lot of money off of forecasting supply disruptions. Ultimately, Thales was able to make money because he forecast that the demand for presses was different than what market participants were expecting. And to sort of see this in play, we can examine a few different stories. We can consider how Victor Niebuhrhofer bought futures in wheat upon hearing that the Mount St. Helens had erupted in 1981, based off of the notion that prevailing winds would carry the dust from the mountain that had exploded over the prime crop growing region of the United States, and that this would result in lower yields come harvest time than had been anticipated before the volcanic eruption. Similarly, in 1992, George Soros speculated that the Bank of England would not be able to sustain the value of the pound. They had decided to join the exchange rate mechanism, England and Germany at the time, and this largely meant having to peg one currency to the other. Now, the challenge for the Bank of England was that England had much higher inflation rates at the time than Germany did, which meant in order to maintain the value of the currency and its peg to the Deutschmark, the Bank of England was continually spending its reserves in order to support the value of the pound. Soros estimated that this was unsustainable, borrowed heavily against the pound, converted those money into Deutschmarks, and over the weekend, the Bank of England was forced to remove its support for the pound. The value of the currency fell 10%. Soros reconverted to pounds, paid off his debt, and made a cool $1 billion over the weekend. Again, based off of the notion that the prevailing wisdom of what the market thought was going to happen was in fact incorrect. We see a similar thing happening with John Paulson and his bets against the subprime mortgages that were being marketed to institutional investors throughout 2007, 2008. Paulson estimated that there was significant problems with the subprime mortgage market in the United States and that the prices simply did not reflect the actual risk that investors were exposed to, regardless of the ratings that were being handed out by various ratings agencies. And so he decided to short sell a number of mortgage-backed bonds and made a tidy sum as the housing market proceeded to collapse over 2007 and 2008. Now, one thing that we should be mindful of is that even though some of these speculators were able to make great money by timing the market properly and understanding what direction the market had misunderstood the facts, the truth of the matter is that the market, as John Maynard Keynes pointed out in the 1930s, can generally stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So it's much caution to any of the global macro speculators. Even though a disruption of supply might look like a good opportunity for trading, be careful because the market is not always as efficient as one might expect.